September 12, 1965, 8:17 p.m., the Lenox Lounge, Harlem, New York. The smoke in the Lenox Lounge hung thick as a sinner's conscience, clinging to the dark wood and the plush red vinyl of the booths. It was a Tuesday, and the air hummed with the low thrum of jazz from the trio in the corner and the murmur of business being conducted in hushed tones. At the center of this universe, in his usual corner booth, sat Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson. He was a statue of quiet authority, his tailored suit immaculate, a glass of amber liquid untouched before him. He didn't need to speak loudly. The entire room was an extension of his will, its rhythm set by the placid, almost bored expression on his face. Finn Lucas, his driver and confidant for a decade, stood near the door, his eyes scanning the room, the street, everything. He was the filter through which the world reached Bumpy. Tonight, the world was coming through the small, flickering black and white television perched above the bar. The program was Finch on the City, a nightly editorial segment hosted by Alistair Finch, a man whose face was a permanent sneer held together by a cheap suit and an abundance of brilliantine. Finch considered himself a crusader for a version of New York that was rapidly vanishing, a city he believed was being dragged into the gutter by crime, moral decay, and the rising tide of black voices. His target tonight was Harlem, and by extension, its unofficial king. And at the heart of this rot, this brazen lawlessness that the police seem either unable or unwilling to contain, we find the so-called Godfather of Harlem. Finch's voice dripped with condescension, a nasal whine that grated on the ear. On screen, a grainy, unflattering photograph of Bumpy filled the screen. Ellsworth Johnson, a man they call Bumpy, a career criminal, a purveyor of vice and violence, who parades through the streets of Harlem as if he were a visiting dignitary, not a common thug preying on his own people. A nervous quiet fell over the lounge. The clinking of glasses stopped. The jazz trio faltered, the saxophone letting out a wounded squawk before falling silent. Every eye in the room, consciously or not, darted toward Bumpy's booth. They were looking for a sign, a crack in the granite facade. A nod from him, and Alistair Finch's world would become very, very small. Finch continued, emboldened by the silence of the airwaves. He fancies himself a community leader, a philanthropist, a wolf in shepherd's clothing. This man and his ilk are a cancer, and they thrive because the good people of this city are too afraid to call them what they are. They are not kings. They are not godfathers. They are parasites, feeding on the decay they themselves create. And the city's leadership, by allowing this man to operate with impunity, is complicit in the poisoning of an entire community. The camera zoomed in on Finch's smug, porcine face. I say it's time we stopped glorifying these gangsters. It's time we fumigated these nests of corruption. It's time we called Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, what he truly is, a cheap hoodlum in a fancy suit, whose kingdom is built on misery. The segment ended. A commercial for toothpaste flickered onto the screen. The silence in the Lenox Lounge was now deafening, heavy with anticipation. Every man in that room, from the numbers runners to the enforcers, was ready to move. They waited for the word. Bumpy picked up his glass. He swirled the amber liquid, watching the light catch its facets. He brought it to his lips, took a slow, deliberate sip. Then, a low chuckle rumbled in his chest. It grew, becoming a full, throaty laugh. It wasn't a forced laugh. It was genuine, rich with an amusement that baffled everyone. He shook his head, a wide grin spreading across his face, and looked over at Finn. A cheap hoodlum, Bumpy said, his voice carrying easily through the silent room. He laughed again. Well, I'll give him this. My suits ain't cheap. The tension in the room snapped. Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd, quickly turning into boisterous guffaws of relief. The jazz trio, taking the cue, launched back into a lively set. The murmur of conversation returned, louder this time, energized. Bumpy had laughed it off. The king was unbothered. The insult had glanced off his armor without leaving a scratch. Finn watched his boss, marveling at the performance. It was perfect. It projected absolute, unassailable power. The broadcaster was a gnat, an irrelevance. Bumpy Johnson was above it all. But as the night wore on, Finn, who knew the man better than anyone, saw something else. He saw the way Bumpy's eyes kept drifting back to the dark television screen, long after the news was over. The smile didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. The laughter had been for the room, for the maintenance of the empire. The silence that followed was for him. Finn knew that the insult itself meant nothing to Bumpy. What mattered, what was eating at him, was the systemic poison that Finch represented. It wasn't about his reputation. It was about the world his family had to live in. September 12, 1965, 11:48 p.m., Bumpy Johnson's residence, Astor Row, Harlem. The heavy oak door closed, shutting out the city. Inside, the opulence of the house was a fortress against the grit of the streets. But tonight, the walls felt thin. Bumpy loosened his tie, the first sign of fissure in his composure. His wife, Mamie, met him in the foyer. She had been watching. "Ellsworth," she said, her voice soft but laced with steel. "You should have let the boys pay him a visit. And prove him right." Bumpy shrugged off his jacket, handing it to her. He walked into the living room, a space of curated elegance, and poured himself another drink. This one he drank quickly. "He's a talking head on a television set, Mamie. He's noise. You don't punch noise. That noise gets into people's heads. It gives them ideas. It gives them permission." He turned to face her, and for the first time that night, the mask of the kingpin was gone. In its place was the weary face of a husband, a father, a grandfather. The face of a black man in America who, despite all his power, all his money, all his men, could not build a wall high enough to keep the poison out. "I know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The gravitas of his public persona had evaporated, leaving behind a desperately vulnerable core. "I know." He sank into a leather armchair, the frame seeming to shrink around him. He put his head in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with a silent, racking tremor. Mamie came and stood behind him, her hands resting on his shoulders, a silent testament to years of shared burdens. This was the Bumpy only she and, occasionally, Finn were allowed to see. The man who understood that his empire of numbers and favors was built on a fault line, that the whole edifice could be swallowed by the very societal hatred he fought to defy. Finch's words weren't about him. They were about his daughter, Elise, and her little girl, his granddaughter, Margaret. They were about every child in Harlem who had to breathe the air that men like Finch polluted. The broadcaster hadn't insulted a gangster. He had threatened Bumpy's legacy. He had reminded him of his ultimate powerlessness. "Margaret," Bumpy mumbled into his hands. "She has to grow up in this." "She has you," Mamie said, her voice firm. "She has us. We protect her." But Bumpy knew some things couldn't be protected by guns or money. You couldn't shoot a broadcast. You couldn't intimidate a systemic idea. He felt a cold dread creep into his bones, a premonition that the noise Finch had made was not an ending, but a beginning. The laughter in the Lenox lounge felt a lifetime away. Here, in the quiet of his own home, there was only the chilling echo of the broadcaster's sneer and the terrifying weight of a grandfather's love. Witness testimony, Finn Lucas. Conducted December 4, 1978. Interviewer: "You saw him laugh it off on TV. What did you think?" Finn Lucas: "Think? I thought it was genius. Pure Bumpy. Let the little man yell into the wind. Don't give him the satisfaction." That's what everyone in the room saw. Strength. But I knew him. When we got in the car, he didn't say a word all the way back to Astor Row. Just stared out the window at Harlem passing by. It wasn't the usual look, you know? The "this is all mine" look. It was worried. Like he was seeing cracks in the foundation. That night, I knew something was wrong. The insult wasn't the point. The insult was a symptom. Bumpy knew the sickness was spreading, and he was scared it was getting close to home. I'd seen him face down hitters from the commission with less fear in his eyes. That's when I knew. That broadcaster, that Alistair Finch, he hadn't landed a punch, he'd rung a bell. And we were all just waiting to see what answered. September 14, 1965, 10:22 a.m., a Harlem street corner. 2 days had passed. The city churned on. Alistair Finch was still on the air, likely basking in the attention. Bumpy had maintained his cool facade, conducting business as usual, but a nervous energy simmered just beneath the surface of his organization. The men were coiled tight, waiting for a command that never came. Finn was making the rounds, collecting the day's take from a number spot on 127th Street, when he saw the headline on a discarded copy of the Daily News in the gutter. The ink was smeared, but the words were stark. Child abandoned in Harlem tenement. Police investigate. His blood ran cold. The article was brief. An anonymous tip. A young girl, maybe 5 or 6, found alone, feverish, in an apartment building. No parents in sight. Finn's mind raced. Margaret was 6. Elise, her mother, was unreliable. Prone to flights of fancy and bad decisions, a constant source of worry for Bumpy. Finn snatched up the paper. He didn't think. He just ran. He found a payphone, his hands fumbling with the dime, his heart hammering against his ribs. He called the residence. Mamie answered. "Mrs. Johnson, it's Finn. Is Margaret there? Is she with you?" he asked, his voice tight with panic. "Finley? What's wrong?" "No, she's with Elise. They were going to spend the day in the park." "What?" The world tilted. The park. The newspaper. The abandoned child. It was a false alarm, but in that moment, it was horribly, terrifyingly real. "No reason, ma'am. Just checking." He hung up the phone, leaning his forehead against the cool metal of the booth, sweat beading on his brow. It wasn't Margaret. Thank God. But the sheer, gut-wrenching terror of that moment was a fire alarm in his soul. He had to find Bumpy. He found him holding court at a luncheonette, calmly discussing shipping routes with 2 of his capos. Finn walked straight to the table. "Boss, I need a word." Bumpy took one look at Finn's pale face and knew. He excused himself, and they stepped outside into the bright, indifferent sunlight. Finn explained what happened, the newspaper, the phone call. He showed Bumpy the article. Bumpy read the headline, his jaw tightening. He didn't react with the same panic Finn had. His reaction was colder, harder. He was seeing the pattern, the chain of events he had dreaded 2 nights ago. Elise took her to the park, Bumpy said, his voice dangerously low. "Call her apartment." Now, Finn ducked back into the luncheonette and made the call. He let the phone ring 10, 15, 20 times. No answer. He came back out, shaking his head. Bumpy's eyes were like chips of ice. The false alarm had done its work. It had stripped away the last layer of denial. The dread was no longer a premonition. It was a reality taking shape. "Find her, Finn," he commanded. "Find my granddaughter. Use everyone. Turn this whole damn island upside down. I want every man on the street. Check Elise's friends. Check the hospitals. Check the morgues. I want to know where she is." Now, the kingpin was gone. The grandfather had taken over. The desperate search had begun. September 14th, 1965, 1 p.m., Harlem. The machinery of Bumpy's empire, usually dedicated to the smooth operation of illicit enterprise, shifted its purpose with breathtaking speed. The command went out not as a shout, but as a series of quiet, urgent whispers that spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Numbers runners abandoned their routes, their satchels of cash forgotten. Enforcers left their posts in bars and social clubs. Every man who owed Bumpy a favor or feared his wrath was now a foot soldier in a frantic search. Bumpy himself was a storm of controlled fury, operating out of the back room of the Lenox Lounge. A map of Harlem was spread across a table, and he moved chess pieces, salt shakers, matchbooks, bottle caps, across it, marking territories his men were sweeping. September 14th, 1965, 3:45 p.m., Elise Johnson's apartment building. Finn and 2 of Bumpy's toughest men, Hollywood Harold and Junie Bird, arrived at the brownstone where Elise lived. The door to her apartment was unlocked. The place was a mess, clothes strewn about, dishes in the sink. But there was no sign of a struggle, just the lingering scent of stale perfume and the oppressive silence of an empty home. A half-eaten bowl of cereal on the small kitchen table suggested a morning interrupted. "She ain't been here for hours," Junie Bird noted, his voice a low grumble. Finn's eyes scanned the room, looking for a clue, a note, anything. He saw a child's drawing taped to the refrigerator, a crayon son smiling over a wobbly stick figure of a girl holding hands with a larger stick figure. He felt a fresh stab of fear. September 14th, 1965, 6:10 p.m., Sydenham Hospital, emergency entrance. The first sweep of the hospitals came up empty. Bumpy had dispatched men to Harlem Hospital, Mount Morris Park Hospital, and every clinic in a 20-block radius. The official response was always the same. No child matching Margaret's description had been admitted. But Bumpy knew the system. He knew how a black child with a distracted mother could fall through the cracks. His instructions to Finn were precise. Go back. Don't talk to the nurses at the front desk. Talk to the orderlies, the janitors, the people who see everything. Use money. Use whatever you have to. Finn arrived at Sydenham, a public hospital known for being overwhelmed and understaffed. The emergency waiting room was a chaotic scene of human misery. He bypassed the front desk and found an orderly pushing a mop down a grimy hallway. He pressed a folded $50 bill into the man's hand. I'm looking for a little girl, Finn said, keeping his voice low. 6 years old. Named Margaret. Might have come in this morning with her mother. He described them both. The orderly's eyes flickered with recognition. Yeah, I think I saw them. Early. The mother was frantic. Said the kid was burning up with a fever. The doc at the desk, Dr. Riley, he took one look, said it was just a summer flu, told her to take her home and give her aspirin. You saw them leave? Finn pressed, his hopes sinking. No, that's the thing, the orderly said, leaning closer. The mother, she caused a scene. Yelling. Dr. Riley told security to escort her out. She was screaming about, I don't know, some man on the television. Said people were looking at her funny, that no one would help her. She seemed paranoid. Finch. The broadcast. Mamie's words echoed in Finn's head. That noise gets into people's heads. It gives them permission. Where did she go? Don't know. They put her out on the street. But the kid, she looked bad, man. Real bad. September 14th, 1965, 7:30 p.m., the Lenox Lounge. Finn reported back to Bumpy. The news that Margaret had been denied care, that Elise had been thrown out, landed like a physical blow. Bumpy didn't rage. He grew frighteningly still. The chess pieces on the map were forgotten. He stared at the wall, his mind connecting the sequence of events with horrifying clarity. Alistair Finch's broadcast paints a target on him and, by extension, his family. The rhetoric emboldens the everyday racism of a man like Dr. Riley. Elise, already fragile, becomes paranoid and hysterical when her sick child is dismissed. She feels the world closing in, the stares, the judgment. And she runs. Not home, but somewhere she thinks is safe, somewhere off the grid. She mentioned someone on television. Bumpy repeated Finn's words. His voice was hollow. Finch. He did this. That son of a bitch. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. She's scared. She's hiding. Where does Elise go when she's scared? The men in the room looked at each other. They knew Elise's habits, her circle of friends, artists, poets, dreamers, some of whom flirted with the city's darker appetites. The old jazz lofts, Finn said, down by the docks, where she used to go with that trumpet player. Go, Bumpy commanded. Take everyone you need. September 14th, 1965, 9:52 p.m., an abandoned warehouse, West Side Piers. The warehouse was a cavernous, skeletal structure smelling of river damp and decay. It had been converted into a series of illegal lofts and crash pads for a transient community of artists and addicts. This was the fringe of Bumpy's world, a place his influence barely touched. Finn and his men moved through the building, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. The place was a maze of squalor. Mattresses on the floor, empty wine bottles, the sweet, sickly smell of heroin cooking on a spoon. They kicked in doors, their sudden, violent presence shocking the dazed inhabitants. They found Elise on the 3rd floor. She was in a small, windowless room, curled up on a filthy mattress. She wasn't high, but she was lost in a fog of fear and exhaustion. Her eyes were wide and unfocused. Elise, Finn said gently. Where's Margaret? She just stared at him, muttering to herself. They were looking. I saw how they looked at us. The doctor, he laughed. Like that man on the TV. They wouldn't help. They wanted to hurt her. I had to hide her. I had to keep her safe. Where, Elise? Where is she? Finn's voice grew more urgent. She pointed a trembling finger toward a small closet in the corner of the room. She's sleeping. The fever, it finally broke. She's quiet now. Finn's heart stopped. He motioned for Junie Bird, who moved to the closet and pulled open the door. The beam of his flashlight fell upon a small shape, bundled in a threadbare coat, lying on a pile of rags. It was Margaret. She was terrifyingly still. Her face, visible in the dim light, was pale and waxy, her lips tinged with blue. A small, ragged breath escaped her chest, a sound so faint it was almost imperceptible. She wasn't quiet because the fever broke. She was quiet because she was dying. Finn felt the floor drop out from under him. He stumbled back, a strangled cry catching in his throat. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He saw not just a sick child, but the culmination of all Bumpy's fears. The systemic poison had found its way past all the guards, all the money, all the power, and had sunk its fangs into the one thing in the world he truly loved. Junie Bird, a man who had seen and done terrible things, gently reached down and touched the child's forehead. He recoiled as if burned. "God Almighty," he whispered, his voice shaking. "She's on fire." Finn snapped out of his shock. Action was the only antidote to this horror. "Get her. We're leaving." Now, Junie carefully scooped the little girl into his arms. She was limp, a dead weight. Elise started to scream, a primal wail of grief and terror as she finally understood. Finn grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. "We have to go. We're going to help her." They moved through the warehouse like specters, a grim procession. The near-death discovery was over. The high-stakes extraction had just begun. There was no going back to a hospital. The system had failed. Now, Bumpy Johnson would have to build his own. September 14th, 1965, 10:14 p.m., West Side Highway. The black Cadillac sedan sliced through the night, its engine a low growl. Finn was at the wheel, driving with a focused intensity that bordered on madness. In the back, Junie Bird held Margaret, trying to shield her small, frail body from the jostling of the car. Elise sat beside him, weeping silently, her face buried in her hands. Finn used the car's radio telephone, a rare and expensive piece of equipment, to call the private number for the Lenox Lounge. Bumpy answered on the first ring. "We have her," Finn said, his voice strained. "Boss, it's bad. It's real bad. She's barely breathing." There was a moment of dead silence on the line. Finn could feel Bumpy's world tilting on its axis. The kingpin, the strategist, the man who always had a plan, was now just a grandfather suspended in a state of pure terror. When Bumpy spoke, his voice was transformed. The cold command was gone, replaced by a raw, ragged plea. "Is she alive, Finley?" "Yes. For now. Don't take her to my house. Don't take her anywhere they'll look for us." Bumpy's mind was already working, building a new reality. "There's a brownstone on Strivers Row. Number 212. It's clean. I own it through a shell corporation. No one knows it's mine. I'll meet you there. I'm making a call." The call Bumpy was making was not to a killer or a capo. It was to Dr. Leon Lenny Ward, a brilliant physician who had lost his license years ago over a gambling addiction and a subsequent entanglement with the law. Bumpy had saved him from a loan shark's wrath and set him up with a discreet, private practice, treating the kind of patients who couldn't or wouldn't go to hospitals. Dr. Ward owed Bumpy his life. Now, Bumpy was calling in the debt. The extraction from the warehouse had been an act of force. This next phase was an act of faith. They were taking Margaret out of the system that had tried to kill her and placing her into Bumpy's shadow system, a world of last resorts and desperate measures. As Finn sped through the streets of Manhattan, he was acutely aware of the terrible irony. Bumpy's criminal empire, the very thing Finch had condemned as a societal poison, was now the only thing that could provide the antidote. He was using the machinery of the underworld to fight a battle for the most innocent of lives. September 14th, 1965, 10:48 p.m., brownstone number 212, Strivers Row. The brownstone was dark, anonymous. As Finn's Cadillac pulled up, the front door opened. Bumpy stood there, silhouetted in the doorway. He had aged 10 years in the last 3 hours. His face was a mask of anguish. Junie Bird carried Margaret inside. Bumpy rushed to her, his hand hovering over her face, afraid to touch, as if his touch might break her. He saw her pale skin, her blue-tinged lips. He heard the shallow, rattling breaths. A sound escaped his throat, a guttural groan of such profound pain that Finn had to look away. This was the true emotional breakdown, the collapse that the public laughter had so masterfully concealed. They laid her on a sofa in the living room. Moments later, Dr. Ward arrived, a harried-looking man in a rumpled suit, carrying a worn leather medical bag. He took one look at Margaret, and his professional demeanor took over. "Get her upstairs. I need a bed, clean sheets, and boiling water. Lots of it," he commanded, already pulling a stethoscope from his bag. "And I need quiet." They carried her to a master bedroom on the second floor. The room became a makeshift intensive care unit. Bumpy stood in the corner of the room, a helpless giant, watching the doctor work. He had orchestrated this, mobilized his forces, secured the location, procured the doctor. He had done everything a man of his power and influence could do. And now, he could do nothing. He could only watch and wait and pray. The withdrawal from the world of the living had begun, and the next 3 days would be a special kind of hell. September 15th, 1965, 4 a.m., day 1 of the vigil. The house on Strivers Row was a tomb of silence, broken only by the sound of Margaret's labored breathing and the quiet, professional murmurs of Dr. Ward. The diagnosis was grim: septicemia, a blood infection, likely stemming from an untreated case of pneumonia. The hospital's dismissal hadn't just been negligent, it had been a death sentence. "Her fever is 105, Dr. Ward said, his face grim in the lamplight. He was administering penicillin from a vial, a massive dose. "Her body is trying to cook itself. We need to get it down. We'll use ice baths." Bumpy watched as Finn and Junie filled the bathtub with ice from every speakeasy and restaurant Bumpy owned in a 10-mile radius. They gently lowered Margaret's small, burning body into the frigid water. She didn't even flinch, her body too lost in the throes of the infection. Bumpy stood in the bathroom doorway, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles white. He was watching his granddaughter be tortured to save her life. His internal monologue was a chaotic storm. He saw Alistair Finch's sneering face, Dr. Riley's dismissive wave, the filth of the warehouse. He saw the entire chain of causality, a sequence of failures, prejudices, and cruelties that had led to this moment. His power, his fearsome reputation, had been utterly useless. Worse, it had been a catalyst. Elisa's paranoia, her fear of being judged as Bumpy Johnson's daughter, had driven her away from help and into hiding. His life's work, the construction of his own kingdom, had inadvertently laid the foundation for this tragedy. He wasn't a king. He was a curse. September 15th, 1965, 2:30 p.m. The fever wouldn't break. Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness, her small body convulsing in febrile seizures. Dr. Ward worked tirelessly, administering medications, monitoring her heart, her breathing. Bumpy had not slept. He had not eaten. He sat in a chair in the corner of the bedroom, a silent, unmoving sentinel. Mamie arrived. She took one look at Bumpy's hollowed-out expression and her granddaughter's fragile form, and her composure cracked. She began to weep, quiet, desperate tears. Bumpy went to her, wrapping his arms around her. They held each other, two pillars of a crumbling world, drawing strength from a shared lifetime of resilience. "You need to do something, Ellsworth," she whispered into his chest. "About that man, the one on the television." Later, Bumpy said, his voice thick. "First, this." He knew she was right. The anger was a cold, hard knot in his gut, but it was a distant fire. The only thing that mattered was the small, flickering flame of his granddaughter's life in the next room. Witness testimony: Finn Lucas. Conducted December 4th, 1978. Interviewer: what was he like during those 3 days? Finn Lucas: he wasn't Bumpy Johnson. The Godfather was gone. He was just a grandfather. Scared to death. I've never seen a man so powerful look so helpless. He'd just sit in that chair for hours, not moving, just staring at the little girl in the bed. He wouldn't let anyone else sit with her for long. Said it was his place. One time, in the middle of the night, I walked past the room and the door was cracked. I saw him on his knees by the bed. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I could see his shoulders shaking. I think he was praying. Bumpy Johnson, on his knees. I never told anyone that. In those 3 days, he made a deal. I don't know who he made it with, God, the devil, himself, but he made a deal. He'd give up anything, everything, if that little girl would just open her eyes. The empire didn't matter anymore. The money, the power, the respect on the street, it was all smoke. The only thing in the world that was real was in that bed. September 16th, 1965, 9 p.m., day 2. The second night was the worst. Margaret's breathing became shallow, her pulse thready. Dr. Ward looked at Bumpy, his expression grave. "Her kidneys are starting to fail. The infection is winning. I've done all I can do with what I have here." Desperation clawed at Bumpy. He turned to Finn. Go back to Sydenham. Find the pharmacy. Get me everything on this list. He handed Finn a list Dr. Ward had scribbled, a series of powerful, experimental antibiotics and diuretics, things a disgraced doctor couldn't procure. Don't ask. Just get it. Finn understood. This wasn't a request, it was a heist. He took Junie Bird and 2 other men. They didn't go in with guns blazing. They went in the back, through the service entrance they knew from the orderly. They found the night shift pharmacist, a small, nervous man. Finn didn't threaten him. He just laid $5,000 in cash on the counter. Inventory mishap, Finn said calmly. This should cover it. The pharmacist, seeing more money than he made in 2 years, saw nothing. An hour later, Finn was back at the brownstone with the medicine. It was another crime, another layer of risk, but no one hesitated. September 17, 1965, 7:15 a.m., Day 3. The new drugs were administered. The vigil continued. The sun rose on the 3rd day, casting long shadows into the sickroom. Bumpy was slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, finally succumbing to a fitful, exhausted sleep. He was awoken by silence. The ragged, shallow breathing that had been the soundtrack to his nightmare for 56 hours had stopped. He shot to his feet, his heart seizing in his chest. He looked at the bed. Margaret was still. Too still. Dr. Ward was leaning over her, his stethoscope pressed to her chest. He looked up, his face unreadable. Bumpy felt the world end. No, he breathed. Then, a tiny, weak voice, thin as a spider's thread, cut through the silence. Grandpa. Bumpy froze. He looked at the bed. Margaret's eyes were open. They were cloudy, weak, but they were open, and they were looking at him. I'm thirsty, she whispered. Tears streamed down Bumpy Johnson's face. He fell to his knees, his body racked with sobs of pure, unadulterated relief. The deal had been accepted. The debt was paid. His granddaughter was alive. The recovery hell was over. Now, another kind of payment was due. October 28, 1965, Federal Courthouse, Foley Square. The consequences came, as Bumpy knew they would. His sudden, intense mobilization, the hospital robbery, the disappearance of his daughter and granddaughter, it all drew heat. The feds, who had been building a case against him for years, saw their opening. They didn't get him for the hospital, but they used the pressure to squeeze informants. They nailed him on a conspiracy charge related to his heroin operations, an old charge they resurrected with new testimony. It was clean, simple, and undeniable. He didn't fight it. He stood before the judge, impassive and calm. He had made his deal. Margaret was alive, recovering fully. Elise was getting psychiatric help. Mamie was overseeing their care. His family was safe. This was the price. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in a federal penitentiary, Alcatraz. As the marshals led him away, he caught Finn's eye in the back of the courtroom. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Finn understood the signal. The first part of the deal was Bumpy's freedom. The second part was about to begin. Alistair Finch was about to crumble. November 1965, United States Penitentiary, Alcatraz Island. Prison was a different kind of silence. The silence of routine, of isolation, of the cold Pacific wind howling outside the bars. Bumpy Johnson, the king of Harlem, was now inmate #1576AZ. But his power had not vanished. It had merely changed form. His mind was now his weapon, and his target was 3,000 miles away. The plan had been set in motion before he surrendered. Finn was his proxy, his hand in the outside world. The dismantling of Alistair Finch would not be a violent act. It would be a systematic, patient, and total annihilation of a man's life, conducted with the precision of a surgeon. Phase 1, Financial Ruin, 1966 to 1967. Bumpy's network was vast. Through coded letters and messages passed through visiting lawyers, he directed Finn to start digging. Finch projected an image of moral rectitude, but Bumpy knew that every man had his vices. Finch's was gambling. Not just horses, but high-stakes card games in illegal backrooms run by men who answered to the commission. Finn didn't threaten the bookies. He bought the debt. Quietly, through a series of shell companies, Bumpy's organization purchased every dollar Finch owed, at pennies on the dollar. Within a year, Alistair Finch's financial life was secretly owned by the man he had called a cheap hoodlum. Then, they simply waited. Finch, overconfident as ever, continued to lose. The debt ballooned. When it reached a critical mass, a lawyer representing an anonymous investment group called in the markers. All of them. At once. Finch was ruined. He had to sell his expensive apartment, his car. He was forced to move into a small, shabby rental in Queens. The pressure began to affect his work. He looked tired on camera, his smugness replaced by a sheen of desperate sweat. Phase 2. Social Ruin, 1968 to 1970. From his cell, Bumpy read everything: newspapers, magazines, gossip columns. He was a student of the city's social fabric. He directed Finn to use his contacts in the press, not to plant stories, but to guide them. A whisper to a columnist about Finch being seen with a young production assistant. A tip to a rival network about Finch's on-set tirades and verbal abuse of his staff. Small things. Corrosive things. Finch had a wife, a family he presented as part of his wholesome, all-American image. That image began to crack. His wife left him. His name, once a byword for crusading journalism, became associated with whispers of scandal and hypocrisy. He was no longer invited to the right parties. The powerful men who had once returned his calls now found themselves permanently unavailable. Phase 3. Professional Ruin, 1971 to 1974. This was the final, most delicate stage. Bumpy knew that simply getting Finch fired wasn't enough. He had to be discredited, his entire platform destroyed. He learned that a major automotive company was the primary sponsor of Finch's broadcast. From Alcatraz, Bumpy orchestrated a letter-writing campaign. He had his people on the outside mobilize churches, community groups, and civil rights organizations in Harlem. They wrote thousands of letters to the company's headquarters. They didn't threaten. They wrote with dignity and pain, explaining how Finch's racist rhetoric harmed their community and made them feel unsafe. They pointed out the hypocrisy of a company that courted black customers while sponsoring a man who vilified them. Simultaneously, Bumpy fed information to a young, ambitious journalist at a rival station, the same one who had reported on Finch's social scandals. The information was a meticulously documented exposé of Finch's lies, his shoddy sourcing, and the direct, harmful consequences of his broadcasts. He even provided a sworn affidavit from the now-retired Dr. Riley from Sydenham, who, tracked down and pressured by Bumpy's men, admitted to being influenced by the anti-crime hysteria Finch had whipped up. The two-pronged attack was devastating. The sponsor pulled its advertising. The rival station aired the exposé. Alistair Finch's ratings plummeted. The station, facing a boycott and a public relations nightmare, quietly canceled Finch on the city. He was fired, his career over. He tried to find work elsewhere, but his name was toxic. He had been so thoroughly dismantled that he ceased to exist in the world that had created him. He had crumbled to dust. Throughout this decade of slow, methodical revenge, Bumpy's real life was lived through the mail. Every week, a letter from Mamie. Every month, a new photograph of Margaret. Photo 1967. Margaret, age 8, missing a front tooth, proudly holding up a spelling test with a gold star. Letter excerpt 1969. Dearest Ellsworth, Margaret started piano lessons. She has your hands, you know, strong and steady. She asks about you. I tell her you are on a long business trip, building something important for our family. Photo 1972. Margaret, age 13, awkward and beautiful in a confirmation dress, standing between Mamie and Elise, who was looking healthy and clear-eyed. Letter excerpt 1974. She made the honor roll again. She talks about being a doctor. Can you imagine? A doctor. After everything. She says she wants to help people so no one ever has to feel as scared as she did. You did that, Ellsworth. You put that idea in her head. Bumpy kept every photo, every letter. They were arranged chronologically in a box under his cot. They were his rosary beads, his proof that the deal he had made was worth it. His own life was a ghost story, a series of identical days in a concrete box. But Margaret's life, the one he had bought and paid for, was vibrant, growing, and real. He was no longer a king building an empire of streets. He was a prisoner, building a future for one little girl. June 11th, 1975, San Francisco Bay. The ferry chugged across the bay, leaving the grim silhouette of Alcatraz behind. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, now 69 years old, stood on the deck, a free man. He was thinner, grayer. The 15-year sentence had been reduced to 10 for good behavior. The fire in his eyes had been banked, replaced by a deep, weary calm. He wore a simple suit, provided by the prison. It felt foreign on his body. Finn was waiting for him at the pier. He, too, was older, his face lined with the stress of running an empire in his boss's absence. The two men didn't embrace. They just shook hands, a long, firm clasp that said everything. "It's done, boss," Finn said as they walked toward a waiting car. "Finch. He's gone. Works as a night watchman at a warehouse in Jersey. Drinks too much. Talks to himself." Bumpy just nodded, his eyes on the San Francisco skyline. It was never about him, Finn. He was just the symptom. The flight back to New York was silent. Bumpy looked out the window at the clouds, a landscape as empty and vast as the years he had lost. He wasn't thinking about Finch, or the empire, or the money. He was thinking about a little girl's voice, thin as a spider's thread, asking for a glass of water. June 11th, 1975, 8:47 p.m., Astor Row, Harlem, New York. The car pulled up to the house on Astor Row. It looked exactly the same. For a decade, this place had been a dream, a memory. Now, it was solid brick and mortar. Bumpy's heart hammered in his chest, a frantic, unfamiliar rhythm. This was harder than facing a judge, harder than walking into Alcatraz. Finn opened the car door for him. "She's waiting." Bumpy walked up the familiar steps, his legs feeling unsteady. He pushed open the heavy oak door. The house was quiet. Mamie was there in the foyer, just as she had been that night a lifetime ago. They looked at each other, and the decade between them dissolved. He opened his arms, and she came into them, and he held his wife, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of home. "She's in the living room," Mamie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He let her go, took a deep breath, and walked into the living room. She was standing by the fireplace, looking at the old family portraits on the mantel. She was no longer the small, frail child of his nightmares. She was a young woman of 16, tall, graceful, with the same strong, steady hands he remembered from the photographs. She turned as he entered. She had Mamie's gentle eyes and his own stubborn chin. For a moment, they just stood there, separated by an ocean of time and pain. He was a stranger to her, a ghost from a past she barely remembered. The man from the stories, the long business trip. He didn't know what to say. "Margaret," he began, his voice raspy and used to gentle things. She smiled, a small, hesitant smile that lit up her entire face. She crossed the room, closing the distance between them. She stopped right in front of him, this old, tired man in an ill-fitting suit. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. Then, she wrapped her arms around his waist, laying her head against his chest. "Hi, Pop," she said. The world stopped. The last wall inside Bumpy Johnson crumbled, not into dust, but into light. He wrapped his arms around his granddaughter, holding her tight, and for the first time in 10 years, the king of Harlem was truly home. His legacy wasn't in the streets of Harlem or the fear he commanded. It was here, warm and alive, in his arms. Final witness testimony, Finn Lucas. Conducted December 4th, 1978. Interviewer: "So in the end, did he win?" Finn Lucas, win? It wasn't a game. He traded a kingdom for a family. Most men like him. They spend their whole lives building something, an empire of stone and money, and they die in it, alone. Bumpy. He built his, saw it was poison, and then spent the rest of his life building something else. He tore down a man, yeah? But that was just sweeping up. The real work was in that brownstone, in that prison cell. The real work was surviving long enough to get back home. I drove him home that night. I saw the look on his face when that girl called him Pop. That wasn't a kingpin. That wasn't a gangster. That was a man who had finally paid all his debts. And yeah, in the end, that's winning. That's the only kind of winning that matters.